glad you're joining us again this week. We're always happy for people like you, people that are interested in what's happening in our Northwest cities. All of the CCX's viewing area. Because good government needs people that are interested and add their ideas to the city councils and the mayors and the staff. And we're happy that you're going to learn a little bit more about government. Now, each week we generally have someone from one of the 9 cities that bring us up to date on what's happening in their city and going to be in the future. But then from time to time we touch on things like the legislature. And I'm glad to welcome Representative Mike Freiberg.
Yep, glad to be back on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Right. We've had you lots of times before, so we're glad to have you back to kind of give us an idea of what you think might happen during this legislative session, which starts next week, I think, right?
Yep, just on Tuesday we'll get sworn in for another term.
Be ready to go. Why don't you give a little information to introduce yourself out to our wider audience, a little bit about your background and getting into the legislature.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Golden Valley. My parents moved there when I was 6 weeks old, so it's pretty much all I've ever known.
Right.
I went away to college, worked on the East Coast for a couple years, but came back to go to law school. And when I was in law school, I got elected to the city council in Golden Valley. I spent 9 years doing that and enjoyed it very much. But in 2012, an opportunity arose to run for the legislature. Decided to give that a chance. I felt, I'd been on the city council for 9 years at that point. I felt like I might, I knew the issues, felt like I had something to offer. I'm married. I have 2 kids, the kindergartner, a 3rd grader. They both go to Robbinsdale Spanish Immersion School in the Robbinsdale School District in New Hope. And, I feel like as a parent, I'm familiar with the public education system, and I've just enjoyed my service so far, both on the city council and in the legislature.
And then I asked you to think a little bit about what do you think your constituents, the people out there, should know about the legislature, because we're going to bring some information to them tonight.
Sure. It's an interesting place. It is a partisan institution. It's different. It's a lot bigger and more partisan, certainly, than the city council that I served on. So it's a very different process. In the city council, you generally operate through consensus. Some votes are split, but most aren't at the city council level. In the legislature, it really matters which party is in the majority, because the majority party gets to elect the speaker, gets to determine the committee structure, who the committee chairs are. They get to determine what bills get heard. So the partisan nature of it, the fact that there are so many committees there, I think really makes it a different, there are a couple different committees and working groups at the city council level, but it's definitely taken to a more dramatic level at the legislature.
Definitely, yeah, because I don't think you have near that in most city councils at all. The issues just don't tend that way, I don't think.
No.
And then ahead of time, we talked about some ideas of what to present, and I thought first let's tell people about that a legislative session is really a 2-year thing, and I'll have you explain to it. What kind of actions does the legislator take during the first year of the session? Because this is a new session starting now, right?
Correct, yeah. So, most of the Senate was not up for election this past year, but every House member, there are 134 of us, all had to either run for re-election or just for election. There were some new seats where incumbents didn't run. So then the new legislature this year will get sworn in on January 8th.
Right.
And it's called a biennium, a 2-year cycle. The first year of the biennium, we focus primarily on the budget. So it's, the state has a budget of about $45 billion. Going, education and healthcare and human services take up the largest percentage of it, but there's lots of other areas too that are really important to the state, whether you're talking about the state parks or the higher, the higher education system, or the roads, the state highway system. So, any legislator can introduce any bill he or she wants to at any point during the legislative session, and most do. I think in the last legislative session there were over 4,000 bills introduced in the House over the full 2 years. But so since the state has a 2-year budget, our sort of the first thing we try to focus on in the first year is setting that budget for the next 2
Okay,
years.
so that, and then what happens mainly in the second year of the biennium?
Historically, the big piece of legislation that traditionally comes out in the second year is the bonding bill. So that's where the state borrows for large capital expenditures, roads, bridges, infrastructure, buildings for the higher education system. But again, during the second year, the legislators can introduce any bill they want,
certainly.
and there are certainly high-profile issues that may not have a budgetary or a bonding impact, but are important policy decisions, and those will certainly be voted on and discussed over the course of the either year of the legislative session, just depending on the priorities.
And then just a separate aside, a few years ago, the whole Capitol got restored, right?
Oh, yeah.
What kinds of things, if people haven't made it over there yet, what kinds of things might they see?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's always been a beautiful building. I mean, certainly, I visited a few state capitals around the country, and I think it's one of the most impressive ones. But it had kind of, it definitely was in need of repair.
Right.
Some of the painting was faded. Some of there was chips in the marble in different places. So about 2 or 3 years ago, we closed most of it down, and they worked painstakingly just to repaint all of the paintings up there. So they had to bring in specialists who are used to painting on marble, and just a lot of work, a lot of time and energy and resources went into it, but it looks beautiful now. And actually, oddly enough, I think one of the areas where it's the most noticeable is in the basement of the Capitol.
Oh, yes,
yeah, it previously had kind of a Silence of the Lambs feel to it. It just kind of felt like a dungeon, but now it looks really nice. It's not spooky to walk around there anymore, and it's I don't know, if people haven't visited it in the last few years, I would strongly encourage them to come do so. And certainly, if they live in the area I represent, I'd certainly I'd encourage them to come visit me as well.
Certainly. And we'll put up your office phone number so people can contact you. All right, the 2017 legislative session, at the very end, there was a very large omnibus bill of approximately 1,000 pages, I think, with very little time to look at it, and it created a lot of controversy, and several issues still remain unresolved about it. Can you give us a little background about what happened and what people are thinking?
Sure. In the last session, there was divided government. There will continue to be divided government, but in the last session, both the governor, it was Governor Dayton, a Democrat, was in the governor's mansion, and then both the House and the Senate were under Republican control. During this past election, we elected a new governor, Tim Walz, also a Democrat, so that won't change. The House did flip from the Republican control to the DFL control. The Senate will remain in Republican control. So, the way, during the last 4 years, it seemed like a lot of the bills were passed by these omnibus bills, and it kind of got more and more extreme, I think, as we, culminating in this 1,000-page bill that you mentioned, which I heard called Omnibus Prime or the Abomnibus bill.
I like that.
Yeah, there were a lot of different names for it, so it kind of lumped in, it was ostensibly a supplemental budget bill, but it included topics ranging from agriculture to transportation to healthcare, so it was just kind of all over the map. The negotiations that were going on between the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, and the Governor's office seemed to be kind of brinksmanship and kind of like playing a game of chicken, and so rank and file legislators, which I certainly was at that point, but arguably some would say I still am, but just had very little input in the process, and it was not a very good process. So we were presented with this nearly 1,000-page long bill. We had about 3 hours to read it before voting on it, which I certainly couldn't read that fast. And the governor had said pretty much all throughout the process that if policy provisions were included in there. There were, I think, 50 policy provisions that he said he objected to. As well, some of the bigger policy questions that we were talking about, like elder abuse, opioid addiction and issues like that were not very well addressed in that bill either. So he, followed through on what he said he would do and vetoed the bill. So, and that did include some good provisions too, which is kind of how these things tend to happen. They make it very difficult for people to vote no or for the governor to veto the bill. But there were certain things in there, cybersecurity funding for the election system. That were non-controversial and people generally agreed on. This wasn't even new money from the state. This was existing money from the federal government. We just had to authorize it legislatively. I have been encouraged this year, going into this session, both the incoming speaker, Melissa Hortman, and the Senate Majority Leader, Paul Gazelka, have said that there are provisions, they want to just pass those non-controversial provisions from the omnibus bill by themselves as one of the first things we do in this session. And I know that includes the cybersecurity funding that I mentioned, which will actually go through the committee that I chair. So hopefully we can get that done really quickly.
Right. So there's a lot of common feelings that maybe this process needs to change?
That's certainly the sense I get. We created a new, there'll be a new subcommittee just dealing exclusively with legislative process reform, which isn't, the most glamorous topic in the world, but I think people saw how badly it was functioning in the last session and felt like something needed to be done. I know there were a couple informational hearings in November and December on this topic, which I attended. So I didn't get I asked to be on the subcommittee, but I didn't get appointed to that one. I'll be on other interesting committees, but I'll continue to follow it with a lot of interest, just because I think there's pretty broad recognition, bipartisan recognition too, that the process hasn't worked really well. And actually, last session I introduced a bill to amend the state constitution to make it harder to pass bills by these omnibus bills that throw everything together. And I was kind of surprised. I got co-authors from both parties, some very conservative Republican legislators who normally I wouldn't agree with on that much, signed on as co-authors to the bill.
Now, people can bring their own ideas to their legislators, whether it's the House of Rep or the Senate. And I thought maybe we talk about this a little bit. How do you keep in contact with the residents of 45B, District 45B?
Yeah, I try to, however, different people prefer different methods of communication, so I try to be as accessible as possible. I'd say probably the majority of my contacts with constituents are through email. I read all my email personally. I find that an easy way to communicate with people. But people send letters too. I try to respond to them. They call my office. If they're constituents, I try to call them back. If they're visiting, I let the staff people who help me out know that, my priority is meeting with constituents.
Definitely,
so, if I'm in a committee and that's the only time they're there, they can, the staff person can hand me a note and pull me out of committee. So I can talk to them, even if it's just for a few minutes in the hallway. I think it's still important to do that. But then, during the session, usually the other members from the District 45 delegation, Senator Rest and Representative Lyndon Carlson, we have town hall meetings. We usually have a couple of those at the Crystal Community Center. I think we maybe scheduled our dates for them for this year. Send out e-updates if people want, I know that people get a lot of...
Which is a good idea, though. For people that are really interested, this would be a good way to keep up to date on what's happening.
Yeah, you can sign up on my legislative website. So if you don't want to receive them, just let me know. A lot of people don't like to receive emails, but you'll only get them if you sign up for them.
Get them targeted at the right people, right?
Yeah, exactly.
People that are interested. Now, people can bring their ideas to you, and it could ultimately end up in changing a law, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So maybe you can give us an example of something where that's happened so we can encourage people out there. If you've got good ideas and things that you think need to be changed, carry them forward.
Sure, no, absolutely. I can give you an example of that. My first term, probably the most dramatic example of that, where a constituent contacted me and it ended up with a change in the law. Unfortunately, it was a tragic situation that led to it. There was a woman lived in Golden Valley. Her son drowned in Worth Lake. They were swimming at Worth Beach in Theodore Worth Park, and there was a lifeguard on duty there, but I don't know. She felt they could have done more
Yeah.
to ensure his safety. I did some research and found out that lifeguards at a publicly owned pool are required to be certified in CPR training, but at a publicly owned beach they aren't.
Oh.
Yeah. So I told her about that. It turned
Right.
out the lifeguard at Worth Beach was in fact certified
Okay.
in CPR, but she still felt like that was a gap in
Oh,
state law
right,
that
right.
should be addressed. So we introduced a bill. It ended up being called Tony Kane's Law, which
Okay.
is named after her
Right.
son. And it went through the committee process,
Right.
and it's now on the Minnesota.
Right.
It's part of the Minnesota statutes. So
Yeah, so I thought we should encourage people out there who have thoughts about government, and bringing them forward brings a whole new thing. Like you weren't aware of that. That's how that operated on the lifeguards, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
And so you bring the information forward and see what happens.
yeah, exactly. And it, not everything does. A lot of it is just, it doesn't need to be something that dramatic
Right,
or tragic,
right,
but
right,
there are,
right.
if anyone finds something in state law that, there are obsolete
Yeah,
laws
yeah.
on the books still in Minnesota. So if people find something like that or find an example of where the law is not working the way it
Right.
should be working, I encourage them to contact me.
And then how do people find out who their legislator is? Because I'm sure there's plenty of people that you could say, who's your House of Rep or who's your senator, and they don't have any idea.
Yeah, no. If you go to the legislative website,
Okay.
like house.mn or LEG for short for legislature,
Right.
leg.state.mn.us.
Okay.
Click on. I think they have a link there called just called Who Represents
Uh-huh.
Me. You can type in your address, zip code. It'll show you who your who your House member, your Senate member, both at the state and the federal
Okay.
level are, and with links on how to
Right.
contact them. And
So people can get more involved in the process as they move along. And now, how can citizens follow a bill that's going through the legislature? Maybe they've heard of something and they're either for or against it. How can they follow what's happening to that bill as it moves along?
Yeah, the legislative website makes it, again, I
Okay.
would say is probably the easiest way
Okay.
to do that. So, and I think you can actually create an account. They have a bill tracking service.
Okay.
So you can just type in the
Right,
bill numbers
right.
that you're interested in, House File 1 and House File 1027, whatever the numbers are once you find out which bills you're
Right.
interested in. And then if something changes with that bill, it gives you an email alert, so it's scheduled for a committee hearing this Tuesday, it's being voted on the floor this Thursday, it was voted on the floor and it passed or it failed. So that's probably the easiest way to
Yeah,
track.
so it's an easy thing to do for those out there that are kind of interested in what's happening in any particular area. Just plug into the legislative website is a good place to get information.
Yeah, the bill tracker I would recommend specifically.
Now, we've referenced the fact that a lot of the legislature's work happens in committees, and I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about it and explain what happens there. How many committees are there in the House of Rep and then in the Senate?
Yeah, it changes kind of depending on who's in charge.
Okay.
There can, the number can kind of ebb and flow.
Sure.
Since I'm in the House, I'm more familiar
Right,
with
right.
with the number there. We did after this past election, we did increase the number of committees slightly. I think it went up from maybe the upper 20s to the lower
Okay.
30s. I don't remember the exact number.
So there's a lot of specific areas where all of these issues are working their way through the process.
Yeah, and the committees deal with what you think, what you expect the state
Right.
government might deal with. So healthcare, education, and then I should mention there are subcommittees too. So when I use that
certainly.
number
Right.
of 30, low 30s, that includes subcommittees too, because there were a few new subcommittees created as well. So they're, energy and climate change. We created a committee with the word climate and, in the title for the first time, because it's such an important issue facing not just the state, but the whole country and the world.
Oh, right. Now, what committees are you on?
Well, for the first time, I will be chairing. I will be the chair of a committee, so I'm excited
Yes.
about that. I'll be chairing the Government Operations Committee, which is a committee that's been around for a long time. The name sounds kind of generic, but it covers. It actually is probably one of the busier committees in the House, and hears a lot of bills. Basically, if there's any bill that creates task force or advisory council or commission, it's required to go through that committee. But then it also has oversight over issues related to elections or local government, although there's subcommittees within there on those two topics. But every bill has to come up through the subcommittee to the committee, so we'll be considering it as well at the committee level. Any bill related to administrative law, any just general state policy covering the different agencies will go through. So that's the committee I'll be chairing. I've been on it a couple times, and I think having been in local government myself, I think it's a good fit for me, and I'm excited about it. I think we'll be able to do a lot of good things in that committee. And then I'm also serving on health and human services policy. So I've been on that the last couple terms and work in public health when I'm not at the legislature. So I think that committee is a good fit also. State government finance, which is sort of the committee I'll be chairing. Government operations is kind of the policy committee. That's the finance committee. I'm on one of the subcommittees, the local government subcommittee, and then also the rules committee. So I'll be on 5 committees.
Well, that keeps you busy.
It should keep me. Yeah, it should keep me pretty busy.
And so that any bill that moves its way through gets a lot of eyes on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, so the main thing the committee, once a bill gets introduced, it gets referred to the committee that kind of is the most relevant to the work of that committee. And then, in the traditional process, the committee will consider the bill. It'll consider amendments to the bill, so the bill can change pretty dramatically in a committee hearing, depending on if amendments are adopted to it. And then once the amendments have been discussed, then the committee members will vote on whether to either send the bill to another committee, because some bills have to go through more than one committee, or send it to the floor for the whole House to take it up. So where kind of the process repeats itself, but with the whole. And I mean, the committee structure, most legislatures around the country have committees. The U.S. Congress has it as well. I mean, it's a way for to delegate some of the work to members to develop expertise in that area, because ideally you'll be considering the closer details of legislation at the committee level and not on the House floor. Right. And hopefully most major issues will have been worked out by the time a bill gets to the floor. Doesn't always work out that way, but that's sort of what
theoretically it should, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what the committee process is there for.
And so that means changes can happen in it all along the whole process, right? Yeah, no, there's a lot of it's possible for a bill to change so dramatically that the author of the bill doesn't even support it anymore. I mean, that sort of thing has happened between getting amended in different committees and then getting amended on the House floor. And the same process happens in the Senate, and then the Senate and the House have to work out the differences together, and it can change even more as part of that process. So then for people that are following a particular issue along, then it might be helpful if they have the time to come over and watch some of the committee's work.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting process for some people, although not everyone.
If it's your thing, or if you're getting more interested in it as time goes along, because sometimes the issue might be the important thing.
Yes.
Like all the young people that have gotten involved in the issue with guns.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure that's an issue we'll be discussing in the upcoming session. It probably the legislation related to firearm safety probably won't go through the committee I'm chairing, but the Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, I think, is the one that will likely be hearing those bills. And that I know is an issue of.
So some issues have got great interest, and others not so much.
Yes, correct.
They're all probably important in their own way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And we've just got a couple minutes. We'll touch on something that may or may not happen, but a lot of states have been legalizing the use of marijuana. What does the legislature, what have they talked about in regards to that, or what do you think?
Sure. I think it's going to be a discussion over the next couple years. Governor Dayton has, it's not solely a partisan issue. I would say for the most part, members of the Democratic Party tend to support certainly loosening the restrictions on cannabis out there. Members of the Republican Party have generally not been, and there's some exceptions on both sides. One very notable exception has been Governor Dayton.
Right.
So he, when we passed the medical cannabis program a few years ago, it is one of the most restrictive ones in the country. So a lot of people haven't been able to use it. It's limited to certain conditions. And it can only be ingested in certain ways. It can't be smoked. And I think, it's good taking a cautious approach, I think, to a level, but I think there's general consensus that, kind of just a prohibition type mentality over cannabis is not effective. So I think we need to start having some conversations about legalizing it for recreational use, and certainly limiting or making the medical cannabis program more accessible, because the way it functions now, it's so restrictive, it's also become very expensive, and there's a lot of people who aren't able to use it. So I think we need to have a lot of safeguards in place if there is a recreational cannabis program put in place. I don't want to see it become another tobacco industry where it's marketed towards kids. So they start experimenting with it at an early age. I'd like to see kind of a public health approach taken to it. So I actually introduced a bill last session that gives the Department of Health the authority to issue regulations relating to the sale and marketing of it. In most states, it's something like the Gambling Control Board or the Liquor Control Board, but I feel like the Department of Health would be able to do it with more of a public health focus. I think the age to purchase it needs to be 21. I think I think there have been disparities in the way the prohibition on cannabis has been imposed on certain groups. So I think we need to look at expungement of if people have had nonviolent convictions for nonviolent offenses related to cannabis. I think there should be a process in place where those can get reviewed and possibly expunged from their record, especially if they're doing something that under the current system would be legal, but it was illegal when they did it. So I mean, there's a lot of people out there, and it's going to be a really complicated issue to deal with. It's going to probably, we talked about the committee process. It's probably going to have to go through every committee in the House. It touches on agriculture, on commerce, on health, on public safety. So it's probably not going to happen very quickly. Possibly not in the first year of the biennium. It might be something that's going to have to wait till the second year of the biennium. But I know there's discussions starting to happen. Governor-elect Walz has indicated a willingness to support it. So I think it's encouraging, and that's an issue. I'd encourage people to contact people, with
definitely,
their suggestions.
You need to get ideas from your residents.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking your time and bringing your expertise and sharing it with our audience out there.
My pleasure.
And we'll ask people out there, if you've got questions or concerns and you live in 45B, be sure to contact Representative Freiberg.
Thank you.
And we ask that you join us next week for part 2 on the legislative issues. Bye.